What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some thoughts and opinions on any potential future remakes or remasters Bethesda game studios might just have in the works. Given all the buzz around, of course, the Oblivion Remaster, this felt just like an easy thing to talk about and what I felt like doing today. So, probably important to mention here at the beginning of this video, though, that we are in fact talking about Bethesda Game Studios. That can get a little confusing because Bethesda Game Studios typically works under Bethesda Softworks, which is their publisher, which is itself owned by ZeniMax Media, its parent company, which is then in turn owned by Microsoft. But oftentimes when people talk about Bethesda, they can a little more generally be actually referring to Bethesda Softworks, which is the company that oversees Bethesda Game Studios, ZeniMax Online, id Software, Arcane, and Machine Games. And that's to say nothing, of course, of the studios that Microsoft owns, like Obsidian now. For the sake of this video, I'm mostly just referring to Bethesda Game Studios, which is pretty much The Elder Scrolls and Fallout, of course, because when we look at Oblivion Remastered, what we're thinking of there, mostly those two franchises. Though probably worth a mention that they did actually work on some other stuff, like some racing games and stuff. And then Bethesda Softworks actually used to put out all of these different types of sports games before they moved into The Elder Scrolls, which then was eventually handed off to Bethesda Game Studios when they became a thing, all the way back in 2001. But again, it's mostly just those two IPs we're looking at. And while it's very easy following the success of something like the Oblivion Remaster to then, say, wish for something for Morrowind, Fallout New Vegas, Fallout 3, etc., I think that would probably be a little harder than people really give it credit for, but also it's, I think, worth talking about that really nobody talks about, say, Fallout 1 or 2, or The Elder Scrolls Arena or Daggerfall. Those would be extremely difficult to remake in any sense, because that would come with, of course, the task of taking those very different genres from a lot of what Bethesda Game Studios makes these days, and either transforming them completely to truly remake them, or working in a style that, let's be honest, they're not really familiar with. Which is why I am of the opinion, then, that that's extremely unlikely, but I don't think that would have really been much of a hot take. I imagine most everyone can see and realize that. But that sort of brings me to my next point, which is that of the games Bethesda could have remastered or had their partner Virtuous remaster, really, Oblivion was likely the easiest option, which is probably why they went with that, because every other game in that roster has things about it that would make it difficult to approach from that standpoint, which is kind of what I want to get at over the course of this video, is basically that Oblivion was the easy one, and lucky for somebody like me personally who was the most interested in that one. And I think that's for a couple reasons. One, not dealing with chance to hit and even a third-person perspective, like you see in something like Morrowind, which has dice rolls associated with the combat, which causes a little bit of a disconnect with it at times. And then, of course, there's its very different speech system in which that you have all these different dialogue options to respond to characters with, because none of it's really voice acted outside of extremely few lines. But ignoring all of that even, Oblivion was easier in the sense that it had a lot of very, very glaring issues with a clear-cut road to improvement. And while I think they'd knocked it out of the park, they did better than even I expected, to be sure, Oblivion had very clear problems with several potential solutions that were readily available, let's say, that didn't cause a loss of the core game, if that makes sense. Now, you can't really say that about these other games that people are asking for remasters or remakes, with the exception of maybe Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas, which have some performance problems that would be, theoretically the easiest thing to clean up there. But all of the other problems with those games are more subjective. They are things that people have very entrenched opinions about when it comes to things like the role-playing aspects or what they do and do not do well. In comparison then to something like Oblivion, which had a pretty straightforward general consensus. With that in mind, I pretty much narrowed this down to the three that I think would be most likely to have any sort of attention given to them, and that is Morrowind, Fallout 3, and Fallout New Vegas. Honestly, I wouldn't expect any of these for various reasons, but let's start with Morrowind. I kind of already touched on this a little bit, because while there are obvious things you could improve, like the graphics, even that actually encounters more of an issue than you may realize, because Morrowind is a small game. At least it's a lot smaller than people tend to think it is, and they sort of go out of their way to obfuscate that by applying a sort of fog filter right in front of the player in many cases. And modern technology, even, like say Open Morrowind, allows you to push that view distance back, and if you do that too much, which is not recommended for this reason actually, you're very likely to reveal just how small the island of Vardenfell actually is. And without the slower base movement speed and that fog filter, you sort of lose some of the magic almost immediately. You really do have to be careful, and you can kind of see why they made that design decision, and that is something you would have to grapple with if you were to remake that, because theoretically you would have to then expand the entire island if you wanted to get those proportions that even actually felt remotely like that original version. And that's before we get into even what would probably be, at least in part, a massively expensive approach to voice acting any of it. Morrowind didn't really have much in the way of voice acting. It was almost entirely text, outside of very few select quests and the like. And even just the simple act of addressing that, no matter which method of which they chose to approach it with, would likely receive some backlash, which is the other part of that. A lot of people hold Morrowind very dear, and while I think the audience that would potentially get into it via something like a remake or remaster would be probably much larger than the fan base that is currently still really enamored with it, there would definitely be a sort of rift there, I would imagine. And that's before you even then get into all the more nitty-gritty details of individual features, like what to change, what to keep, etc. And as a result of that, I think you have to ask yourself then, is that a can of worms you want to open in that regard? And I think in many ways it would probably just be easier to be like, no, let's not. Now, for all I know, financially it may very well be worth the headache, but I do think it is something you have to factor in. Now, Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas are a bit of a different story in the sense that they do actually have some things that I think people would generally like to see improved. For instance, Fallout New Vegas even made a lot of interesting and often, I would say, just straight up better choices in terms of how the level ups and the perks worked and the pacing of it, in terms of character progression that 3 could take a lot of cues from just right off the bat. And then there's also just the performance of both of those titles. New Vegas in particular is known for being, let's say, very crash prone. And Fallout 3 often runs into that problem where their engine can only handle you going like 60 FPS, and most modern hardware can just blow Fallout 3 out of the water, so you have to sort of limit yourself not to run into problems, and there's all sorts of little stuff like that that could be fixed, yes. But for Fallout 3 in particular, there's probably the most obvious thing they could fix or address, which is the ending and some of the voice acting there. It's pretty well known that the original release of Fallout 3 had a very silly ending where you're forced to subject yourself to lethal doses of radiation despite the fact that there are several people potentially in the room with you who are just straight up immune to radiation. And it's clear the story they were going for there and everything, but they eventually addressed that via Broken Steel, which was still a little snarky itself about the entire situation. And then, do you address that? Do you change it? Do you just keep all of those voices the same? But outside of those things, I do think Fallout 3 would, if they wanted to continue down this path, be the next most logical step. Because while plenty of people will, forever debate which one is better, Fallout 3 or Fallout New Vegas and all that stuff, most people do generally see the things that Fallout 3 could improve upon. And much like Oblivion, while it is certainly aging, its gameplay is relatively modern in comparison to everything else, like Fallout 1 and 2 as an example. Now, on the flip side of that, people are of course going to bring up New Vegas, obviously. That one's slightly more complicated, of course, because of Obsidian's involvement. Now, while it is very possible, certainly, for Bethesda Game Studios to, of course, hand off that remaster to basically anyone, I think the natural fit there would probably be Obsidian, but they are obviously busy with a million other things themselves at the moment, and thus it would have to be somebody else more than likely. And then there's probably some etiquette involved there because, how much of that game do you look at? Who do you involve in terms of just helping out with the development of it? Do you tap Obsidian to answer questions, follow up on stuff? And sure, all those things are possible, won't deny that. It just seems like a lot of extra steps and headaches because, as I'm sure many people are also aware, Fallout New Vegas has this sort of almost mythologized presence among the Fallout series, and I'm admittedly not as enamored with Fallout as a lot of people are myself, so that's why you don't see me speak about it with quite as much reverence as many of its diehard fans have. It becomes, in my opinion, another sort of situation where is the money they could potentially make off of this enough to deal with the inevitable headache and, pun intended, fallout of that. And the thing that kind of goes with that, though, is then how much of Fallout New Vegas can you really change before you lose the spirit of what that game is meant to be? And while it's easy to say things like, oh, sure, you could add in all the cut content that was there, that kind of thing, flesh it out, because of course, course, the short time frame in which that game was made. Does changing all of that stuff on top of potentially adding in anything like that then lose the vision of what the larger game was all about? But I will admit, in this case, I don't think that's anything insurmountable. So to sort of kind of start wrapping this up, basically I would say my thoughts on future remakes or remasters for Bethesda game studios is this. Of all of them, I think Fallout 3 or Fallout New Vegas would be the most likely, and of those two, Fallout 3 seems like the obvious option. Because much like with Morrowind, Fallout New Vegas itself and doing anything with that game would inevitably come with a whole bunch of internet discourse no matter what happened, because people love to pit Bethesda and Obsidian against each other at every opportunity, despite the fact that I don't get the impression either of those companies cares much about it at this point. Fallout 3 seems like the obvious pick because it has a lot of things that it could clearly improve on, just like with Oblivion. And it would likely also be just the least drama and hassle-free one to deal with. And then at that point, in the theoretical future here where that inevitably got released, if it did well, you then had maybe built up enough goodwill to start branching out to thinking about these other ones. But even that is under the precarious assumption that they continue to work with a partner to do all of this, because as Bethesda Game Studios themselves is currently engaged with The Elder Scrolls 6, they are not going to have a lot of time personally to do much beyond that for at least the next few years. And while this is all well and good and fun to talk about, I don't think we would be seeing this for quite some time. Like the late 2020s here at the very least. But I do think that's probably as good a place as any to wrap up this particular video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.